Hello and welcome to our next NAP. NAP stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points, and I'm Irina Ryshkova, your nonprofit auditor. This video is not authoritative. This is just simply my experience sharing with nonprofit community. Okay, let's talk about time-restricted grants. As an auditor, I see very often that nonprofits do understand purpose-restricted grants, but they not always treat with the same respect time-restricted grants. Let's talk about it. There's two types of restrictions, and please remember that restrictions only come from the donor. Restrictions do not come from the board. Restrictions do not come from executive director or overall intent internally from the organization. It's only come from outside donor. Donor can put restrictions, donor can remove the restrictions, but internally, either board member, management, organization overall cannot change the restriction. And restrictions from the donor come in two forms. They're equally important, either purpose or time. We discussed purpose restrictions before many times, many examples, and the purpose restrictions when the donor put restrictions which is narrower than overall mission of the organization. But today I want to concentrate on the time restriction. Sometimes donors specifically indicate the grant is giving for the period, and they will indicate 12 months, 36 months, or April 1, 2023 through April 1, 2025. So that's a 2-year restriction. When the donor specifically identify a period, what is the donor telling you? We want these funds to be specifically spent during that period of time. If the donor does not identify any other purpose restrictions, then it means that it's only time restriction. And therefore, the organization needs to release funds straight line in accordance with the time. If it's 36 months, then you take amount, divide by 36, and release each month that portion of the grant. I have a question sometimes received from other nonprofits why we cannot accelerate and spend it in the first period of 36 months and spend less. Again, the donor does not indicate what you spend it for. There you cannot decide, you can decide internally what you get spending this money for, but the donor intent does not indicate what the money needs to be spent for. The donor intent indicates how the money needs to be spent. So if your organization internally decided to separate these funds for whatever expenses you want to spend, it does not mean that you can accelerate or spend it slower, because again, only from donor intent, and donor intended it to be for the period of 36 months. Therefore, very often we see that when the donor restricts by time, sometimes nonprofits do not pay attention on the time. They say, oh, we can spend it because there's general purpose, and they do not forget to look at the time. Please treat time restriction with the same cautions and respect as we do purpose restricted grants. Other time we notice that even if nonprofits do see time restricted money, they start restricting it for whatever purposes they want. For example, they want to do it for fundraising events annually. Therefore, if they skip the fundraising event this year, they will not release funds. And that's, again, not a proper treatment. Please remember that restrictions only come from the donor. In other instances, we see that sometimes grants come to nonprofit, and even if they do not have any restrictions at all, The nonprofits decides to use them for whatever purpose they want, and they will put them in restriction because internally they designated these funds for this type of purpose. Again, your nonprofit can do that, but it's still unrestricted funds. Your financials cannot show that they're restricted. Your internal decision how to use money, it's up to you, especially if there is no restriction from the donor. But you cannot change your accounting standards for your nonprofit and say these are restricted because internally we as a management decided to use these funds for these purposes. Now, board can designate funds, unrestricted funds, for whatever purposes they want, but again, they will be coming from the pool of unrestricted funds without the donor restrictions, but they will be designated. That's a different type of designation. They're not part of the restricted donations, and they should not be recorded as restricted. Sometimes we receive a question saying, what if donation comes restricted by time, but also purpose? In this case, you do need to go by both. If it's restricted by 36 months and they say, but you also have to spend for that purpose, then if it's not spent for that purpose during that time, you will not release it. So purpose gonna be more important in this case. So, but only if the grant has both time and purpose restriction. So just to summarize, we do understand that internally nonprofit manage the funds the way they understand their programs and where the needs are, and it can change. However, general accepted accounting principle GAAP, when they referring to net assets with donor restrictions or without the donor restrictions, they only reference to grants that restricted by a donor, not internally. Therefore, for bookkeepers and management, it's critical to understand what was the donor intent and if the funds truly restricted by donor, either by time and purpose, and releases needs to be done in accordance with the donor wishes. One more thing, if I may add, if your nonprofit conducts the event or does fundraising procedure and indicating that these funds will be used for any specific purpose, and the donors come and donate for that event specifically for that specific purpose, that would be restricted by purpose because the nonprofit invited donors to donate for that specific purpose. An example would be fundraising event to raise funds for capital improvement for the building. If the nonprofit announced that they're going to have an event where the donors can come and support capital campaign to do leasehold improvements on the building, these funds are restricted for that purposes because donors' intent was to donate for that specific purpose. Again, to summarize, net assets with donor restrictions only come with intent from a donor, not from the board, not from the management, only from the donor. Only donor can restrict by time or by purpose. Thank you, be safe, and record in accordance with GAAP. Talk to you soon.